Every industry has its most hated brands, the Spirit Airlines or McAfee antivirus companies of the world, but perhaps no other industry has quite as many hated companies as the watch industry. And right at the very top of most enthusiasts' lists for hated watch manufacturers stands a company called Invicta. Now, there are many legitimate reasons for this. It's not entirely undeserved. Invicta inflates their prices and then offers massive discounts. The watches themselves are low quality, gaudy, and often derivative, though not able to compete with the major players like Rolex and Casio. Invicta's sales are significant and they're also growing significantly, especially here in the States. But Invicta didn't always inspire rage in the horological world, and interestingly enough, the Invicta brand goes all the way back to the early days of industrial Swiss watchmaking, having been founded in 1837. Not quite as old as Longines or Blancpain or Breguet, but significantly older than Rolex and Omega, but no other Swiss manufacturer has quite the same kind of story as Invicta. It all started back in 1837 in one of the most significant Swiss towns for watchmaking, La Chaux-de-Fonds, and despite their success early on, the company switched their name in 1928 to just Invicta, the Latin word for invincible. This was meant to really show what they were all about as a company, a Swiss watch brand that developed sort of tough, reliable, do-anything watches. In this sense, they actually stood out and sort of carved a niche for themselves in the early days of the Swiss watch industry. By the mid-20th century, Invicta had made their mark, but they began struggling in the 50s and ultimately went bankrupt. And then, of course, every traditional Swiss watch manufacturer was put on notice as quartz movements came into the scene. The Invicta brand would find itself under ownership in America, and they attempted to stay afloat making affordable quartz watches, but in 1987, Invicta would be forced to sell its assets to a company called Ondix SA. Things would move around a bit like they do, but by 1996, Invicta became Invicta Watch Group, and around this time, CEO Eyal Lalo began working to build Invicta into a modern global watch brand. At this point, the goal was really to reinvent the brand by shifting its focus away from its Swiss heritage that had defined it for over a century. Operations were moved to Florida, and the focus was primarily on bold, oversized, and attention-grabbing designs rather than the subtle, traditional Swiss aesthetic of its earlier years. This period marked the start of a new era for Invicta, one in which the brand would attempt to make a name for itself through affordability and style and really aggressive marketing. And it was during this time that the company began producing more fashion-oriented watches with a particular emphasis on large, sort of statement pieces that caught the eye. In terms of the brand as a business, this was a brilliant move. The Swiss luxury watch industry was on its way back, thanks in part to the Swatch Group, but how could a company like Invicta stand out in that market on their own? Instead, they realized that there was this whole different potential market that wasn't really being tapped into. Affordable watches at this time, think Casio and Timex, they weren't really going all in on bold designs, they were more practical tool watches. Invicta went with a different approach. One of their first standout pieces at this time was the Pro Diver. This watch was and is incredibly popular. It was really a cheaper version of that iconic dive watch profile that was popularized by, some of the best known brands in the world, but the price was a tiny fraction of the price of those watches. As the 2000s carried on, Invicta began making more kind of garish designs for their collections. A Pro Diver could look something like this, or it could tip the scales at over 50 millimeters and look like this. Yes, that's a dive watch. Please go dive into a volcano with it on. Around the time that Invicta designs began to get wild, the company began experimenting with various marketing techniques. Beginning in the early 2000s, Invicta aligned itself with platforms like ShopHQ and QVC, a move that would define its marketing strategy and reshape its entire public image. This approach capitalized on a unique and underutilized retail channel, which was the home shopping television, to aggressively promote and sell watches to a broad, non-enthusiast audience. Unlike traditional watch brands that relied on boutique experiences or, authorized dealers, Invicta became one of the first watch companies to embrace a direct-to-consumer system, and they did it through television marketing. This allowed the brand to bypass the gatekeeping that's often found in the luxury retail space and present its products directly to millions of viewers in real time. I'm sure many of you have seen these broadcasts feature live demonstrations and super enthusiastic hosts and dramatic value comparisons and countdown timers. Invicta watches were marketed heavily discounted, $1,200, yours today for $179 for, a $40 watch. And this really appealed to, of course, impulse shoppers. The presentation style on these networks, it's pretty theatrical. Hosts would highlight exaggerated specifications like the case size and the number of components and the plating thickness, and they tried to frame Invicta watches as these bold luxury alternatives that were at an accessible price. Collections like the Pro Diver, the Bolt Zeus, the Reserve Sub Aqua, they were centerpieces on these broadcasts, and they showcase these kind of flamboyant details and elaborate packaging, and the messaging emphasized exclusivity and prestige despite the fact that Invicta was absolutely producing these watches at mass scale. Now, this strategy has had significant consequences for the brand. On the one hand, they became one of the most recognizable brands in North America, moving hundreds of thousands of units annually and actually fostering a loyal fan base. On the other hand, the company opened itself to criticism from traditional watch enthusiasts who viewed the television sales model as cheap and misleading. The aggressive discounting and overblown retail MSRP claims were seen as many as kind of undermining the credibility of the brand and of the industry as a whole. Nevertheless, Invicta's partnership with TV shopping networks proved to be a brilliant commercial maneuver. It gave the company a lot of visibility and direct engagement with consumers and a marketing platform that tailored to emotional buying, all without needing to compete directly with heritage brands in the luxury retail spaces. It also aligned perfectly with Invicta's embrace of spectacle and showmanship, turning what might have been just another resurrected Swiss name into a household watch brand. But there's no denying it was all thoroughly un-Swiss, and that was what Invicta buyers wanted. Invicta's modern watch designs are known for being large, colorful, bold, and some would say ugly, gaudy, garish. Some of them are subtle, but they're more known designs that contrast sharply with the more traditional, understated designs of luxury Swiss watchmaking. These are the watches that I think they sell the most of, though they do sell a heck of a lot of simple, Pro Divers. I will say, though, that at this point, they're no longer entirely out of their lane with companies like Hublot and Richard Mille with making, gaudy but apparently luxury designs. I think one of the best things that happened for them was that companies like Hublot and Richard Mille blew up because Invicta could continue to say that they were luxury alternatives. Invicta has been accused quite a bit of copying these brands, and of course for copying Rolex and Omega. Sometimes I think this is a bit unfair. Is the Invicta Speedway any more of a Rolex Daytona copy than, say, the Hamilton Jazzmaster? I don't think it is. Or even the Baltic Tri-Compacts. I mean, there's so many watches copying the Daytona at this point. But then there's the Pro Diver, which in a lot of ways looks to be a literal copy of a Submariner. And the S1 Rally, okay, that's a bit too far. Tag Heuer could probably sue for that one. At its core, Invicta's greatest offense is not that it offers affordable watches. The world needs entry points into watches, and budget brands can serve that purpose. The problem is how Invicta presents itself, not as an entry-level brand, but as a true luxury brand with luxury timepieces that are, wildly inflated in terms of MSRP claims, garish designs, and also questionable build quality masked by over-the-top specifications. A $150 watch may be honest if it's marketed as a $150 watch, but when it's positioned as a $1,200 value slashed to a once-in-a-lifetime price, I don't know, it kind of ceases to be honest. Enthusiasts who value integrity in branding and communication can see Invicta for what it is. Sometimes it feels like the company is just doing, scummy, manipulative, deceptive marketing. Then there's the matter of design, or more accurately, the lack of originality in design. Invicta's most popular models, including the Pro Diver, they're essentially copies of watches like the Rolex Submariner. These aren't subtle homages or design inspirations. These are duplication. The hands, the dial layout, the bezel, and even the case shape are almost indistinguishable at a glance. And while homage watches do have their place in the market, there should be a line between inspiration and imitation. And Invicta stands out as an American, not Chinese brand, but American brand that regularly crosses that line. I will say, though, we have to be honest, as much as I also love Casio and Timex, they sometimes do the same thing. On top of this, the brand's obsession with oversized, flamboyant, and absurdly styled watches, especially, collections like the Bolt Zeus or the Reserve, These watches seem to be just more about spectacles than usability. There's just so many excessive details, heavy-handed logos, gold plating, and just diameters that defy the human wrist. But I'm okay with all of this. If people like them and want to wear them, who cares? The irony of all of this is that Invicta could be so much more. The brand has the manufacturing scale, the pricing power, and even the historical roots to create genuine, value-driven watches. And they have occasionally flirted with this. Some of their limited edition models that use Seiko or Sellita movements have shown that this brand is capable of substance. In the end, I think that the criticism from watch enthusiasts is correct when it's not driven by elitism, but just kind of by disappointment. Invicta could be a great gateway brand, a company that introduces people to quality watches in a way that's dignified and honest and lasting, but instead it opts for just terrible marketing and sometimes poor quality. For people that care about craftsmanship and heritage and the stories that are told, Invicta feels like a brand that's shouting in a room where everyone else is just trying to have a conversation. Now, I actually do think there's hope for Invicta. There is a trend among companies that have been previously focused more on affordable watches. Think companies like Casio and Timex and even Citizen. And that trend is that these companies are trying really hard to make more thoughtful, subtle, kind of timelessly designed watches. Enthusiast watches. Think Casio's vintage line or Timex's Q watches or kind of the resurgence of Timex's Marlin. Now, I know that there's no comparing these companies to Invicta. I mean, Citizen, for example, already makes Grand Seiko competitor watches, and some of their best watches are JDM ones. But Timex, for example, has significantly shifted their design language in the past decade to really cater to enthusiasts. And people love it. People are rooting for Timex, and I think people would root for Invicta. They could do the same thing, but they're not really struggling as a brand. This is kind of their place in the market, and as much as you and I may not love the brand, they do have every right to make big, ugly watches, and people have every right to enjoy them. Just the other day, I talked to someone who was all excited about their Invicta watch that they just gotten, and honestly, talking to them, I was kind of excited for them. I don't like the Cybertruck, for example, but if I met a Cybertruck owner who loved it and wanted to show me how cool it is, I'd go along with it. Okay, I think I would rather humor Invicta owners than Cybertruck owners, but what I do know is that I would love to hear what you guys think. Have you ever owned an Invicta watch? Maybe it was your first watch and you still have it. Or maybe you have one of Invicta's older watches. Either way, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more watch stories, and we'll see you in the next one.